Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with another edition of the RTC book club reviews. If you're just joining me for the first time, I have a monthly book club thing. I have a chat on Instagram. You're welcome to join at any time. It's an open book club. And then just let me know that you want to be part of the book club. You're going to read along with us. And I will add you to the chat on Instagram and you can join the discussion about the book when we do that. It's really fun. I'm really enjoying it. We've had some really, really good talks in there, so I'm really, really enjoying this. And right now we're going through a year of Greek myth retellings, and I deviated from that slightly with a kind of Roman myth retelling. There's some overlap here, and I'll explain like the history why. But the book we read for the month of September was The Heir of Venus. I will do a spoiler-free review, and then I'll let you know when I'm going to spoil the book. So if you do not want to be spoiled, don't worry, I'll let you know. And then I'll do the spoiler part later to give my more in-depth thoughts and stuff. If you have read this book already and independent from the book club, but you would like to join the conversation, you can also let me know and I'll add you to the group chat there. And then if you would like to join for next month, the book that we're going to read next month is going to be Medea by Eilish Quin. And that's going to be the book for October. So if you want to pick that one up and join in the club and start reading along, you absolutely can. Like I said, it's an open club, so you're welcome to join for a month, leave for a month, come back whenever you want. If you have the book, join in. If you don't. But yeah, it is what it is. So let's get into it. So The Heir of Venus is by Laura Shepperson. And if I was going to give this an arbitrary rating, because the numbers don't really matter, I would give this 6 potatoes. 6 potatoes. I very, very middle of the road on this book. It's very meh to me. I found it to be a little bit boring and a little bit disorganized in the telling, and I just didn't really enjoy the format of the book, which is interesting because I enjoy the way that the story is written in other stories, but for this one it was just a little bit chaotic and all over the place for me, so I think that's why I was having a hard time getting immersed into the story. But also the story wasn't like super exciting. There wasn't a lot going on. It was just sort of recapping and then like bringing it up to modern day of Aeneas' history. So if you are not aware of, this story is centered around the women who are involved with the hero Aeneas, who is the star of the Aeneid. And the reason I picked this book is because I've never read the Aeneid. I actually have very little knowledge about it. I have a general idea of what the story is about, but because like I've chosen to never read it on purpose, because it's essentially Odyssey fanfic, and I'm very familiar with the Odyssey, so I didn't see like a reason to jump into the Aeneid. And that's a little bit of a like diminutive way to look at the Aeneid. It's a little bit more than that. It's not one for one like a copy of the Odyssey, but there's a lot of parallels to it. And so I just was never very interested, because essentially the history behind the Aeneid is that it was written by Virgil. The Odyssey was written by Homer, and it was basically commissioned by the Caesar to like feature him as the main character, but like in a positive way. He was like, I want to be the self-insert here, so write about me but make it cooler. And Virgil was kind of a rebel without a cause. If you've read any of Virgil's work, he's the same author for Dante's Inferno, and he was like, yeah, I'll write about you, guy that I don't like, whose politics don't match my ethics. I'm gonna make you look like a shithead, but also like I'm not stupid, like I'm not trying to get executed over this, so I will make you like a hero and cool stuff will happen. And essentially it is the story of Aeneas' journey from Troy to Italy in order to found Rome, because he's the founder, mythologically speaking, of the city of Rome. And his mother is the goddess Aphrodite in Greece, but also Venus in the Roman Latin side of the world. So that's how we get the Heir of Venus. That's how we got here. And I I wasn't interested in the Aeneid, and I think maybe that disinterest probably carried a little bit over into my reading of this book, because I wasn't really interested in a lot of the stuff that happened. And I feel kind of bad because the book was well written. You know, like, it was very easy to understand and follow along. I didn't find it too, like, complex or anything like that. I do think the narrative is sort of centered around the different women that he was involved with. That's his final wife, Lavinia, his first wife, I just forgot. Hold on. His first wife, Creusa, and his second wife, Dido. And wife is a little bit of a loose term there. And it follows their stories and, like, their interactions with Aeneas from their perspectives, and it sort of bounces around. So it's in long sections, which is very, very good. Thankfully, the sections for each woman is like an hour of listening to. I listened to this on Audible, and it follows that for like an hour, and then it bounces to another woman for an hour, and then like another woman for another hour, and, you know, goes back through like all of them until it gets to the conclusion of their various stories and tales. And it just was, it was very okay. And like, I hate when books are like this, because it puts me in a weird position on what to say, because I don't have a lot of strong negative feelings about the story, but I don't have a lot of strong positive feelings either. So, like, it is what it is. Without any more spoilers, let me think what else I could say. I think my biggest problem, outside of the fact that there's not a lot of action, there's just a lot of telling. There was a lot of telling in the story of just sort of like, here are the facts of this person's life, and we're going down the checklist of major events to make sure that we get across everything we need to know about Aeneas. But I think just the way that it was done left me with not a lot to work with on the subject of Aeneas. Like, I listened to 3 different women's perspectives of him. I still don't have a very good understanding of his, like, thought patterns or behaviors or anything like that. I still don't really know. And I wish I had more of an understanding of this character, because it was just sort of like, yeah, there's this guy, and he's a guy who does things, and sometimes maybe he's a little bit of a coward, but he's genuinely fairly across the board a level-headed dude who just is on a mission to get something done. And I think part of the issue is that the story is called the Heir of Venus. Venus plays very small of a role in this story, so we don't even get the interaction from, like, his mother's perspective and why all this stuff is happening. Essentially, there is a prophecy around Aeneas's birth that he will found a great city. It'll be essentially the second Troy, and it'll be like a refuge for the Trojans after the war. And there's a little bit about how he seems to be, like, aided by his godparent during the Trojan War, and how she's given him this mission, so she's sort of protecting him so that he can get to this mission. But you never really get any of her perspectives or any interaction with her as a character in any sort of way in the story, and that made me a little bit sad, because I do like when these myth, like, retellings incorporate those aspects of divinity, and it just wasn't present. But yeah, the narrator did great. I think maybe she could have distinguished the female character voices a little bit more, because I did find myself at times trying to remember whose chapter I was in. But otherwise, the reading was very well done. And I just didn't find myself, like, connecting with any of the characters. I think I actually liked Creusa. I have such a hard time remembering her name. I don't know why. She was probably my favorite character in the book. I liked her perspective more, but I feel like we got a lot more with her character because she got to grow up with Aeneas, so you kind of got more of a time to, like, a window of time to watch. But otherwise, yeah, that's everything I had to say that's not spoilery, because the things I could say are very big spoilers for the story. So if you don't want to be spoiled, depart. Come back once you've read the book. Maybe you can let me know what you think in the comments below. But yeah, so essentially, spoilers. Essentially, the story is told from the main protagonist's perspective, which is Lavinia, who is the young woman that ends up in a situation where her father has decided, because of prophecy again, that she needs to marry a man not from her country. And so when Aeneas shows up on their shores, he's like, boom, marry this guy. He's a prince. He's the son of, Venus. And that's like a big deal here because we all worship Venus. So there's nothing else to go with this. You're going to marry this dude. And she doesn't want to marry this dude because by the time Aeneas gets to her country, he's old. And they don't really tell you how old, but I'm guessing he's like in the 40s. 50s-ish. They mention that his hair is thinning and he has like a bald spot going in the back. So he's at least in his upper 30s, 40s. And she's a young woman. She's like barely 18, like barely legal type of situation, like she's very young compared to him, and she's not really interested in him. She has no interest in him. They don't really communicate before this happens, and she's a little bit blindsided by it because she thought she was going to be in a position to choose who she wanted to marry, and that maybe she would be able to just sort of inherit her father's kingdom. But he was like, no, you're silly, you're a girl. That was never going to happen. But the other aspect of this decision, the other consequence of this decision, in addition to being like a blindsided tactic by her father to Lavinia, is that Lavinia had a childhood friend from a neighboring kingdom that she used to play with, who always assumed that they were going to marry. So when they announced that she was going to marry Aeneas, he takes it very, very personally, and in a way that I thought was kind of interesting, and I kind of wish we had gotten more time with this particular character because I wanted to understand the character shift, because it's mentioned a lot of times. This guy comes to her father's court, basically is like, you were supposed to marry me, but why would you marry this guy? Like she had any choice, which doesn't make any sense. And then he declares war until he's allowed to marry Lavinia, because they were always supposed to be together. He's been in love with her this whole time, to the point where like her friends are like, yeah, he's always loved you, you just haven't noticed. And she's like, what the fuck do you mean? Which, like, we have sort of that characterization of like this nice guy who like always was there for her, super kind to her, sort of buttering her up so that he could sort of be like, obviously I'm the correct choice for you. But when somebody else is chosen for her, I don't want to say that she chose somebody else, but when somebody else is chosen for her, he's like, but what about me though? I spent all this time being nice to you. You should marry me instead. And it gets to a point where Lavinia is actually really shocked that his whole character seems to have like flipped a coin, like changed at the drop of a dime, with this like minor inconvenience to his life plan. He goes from being like a very friendly, happy-go-lucky guy to this like downright asshole, like this little tiny prick who feels so entitled to her that he's going to start a war. And she has a very hard time reconciling this new bit of his character with the kid that she knew growing up. But unfortunately, we don't get a lot of time with like seeing the dynamic between these two characters before this moment in order to understand how that impacts her, or how this is such a big like surprise gotcha moment where his character, like his true character, is revealed once he gets denied the woman he felt entitled to. And I kind of wanted more of that and less of many other things. There's a couple interactions between Lavinia and Aeneas where she sort of gets a feel for his like personal character, and the conclusion that she comes to is that he's very hardworking, very dedicated, loyal to his people, and like devoted to trying to get them a new home and this mission that he's on. But also he's kind of a dick, which is to be expected. He doesn't really think a lot of women to begin with, and while he's not like downright rude to her or mean to her in any way, he's very dismissive of her and very controlling. He's also very domineering to the point where he's, while they're in the middle of this like war, ends up sort of superseding her father, who is the king, as like the head of everything, to the point where her father sort of left off to the side, and she comes to terms with the fact that her father isn't just like not the strong person she always believed, but also getting older, and it's easier for young men to sort of brush him to the side because he is such an old man who isn't very like, doesn't have a very strong backbone. So like I thought those things were more interesting, like the relationship between her father and herself, and how she has to reconcile, like, your parents getting older. Like, we all kind of go through that, where you realize that maybe your parent isn't the person that you always believed they were, or, you know, that your parents are getting older, so they're less strong and less capable than they might have been in their prime. All that noise is my cat, so he's just getting comfy. And, like, those were things I was interested in, as opposed to her dynamic with Aeneas, because there wasn't much there. It was just kind of like, yeah, this guy is like a typical man, but he's not the worst of the typical men in this era, so not such a bad choice. And then seeing how her childhood friend is acting so entitled and so privileged in this situation, that he can start a whole war because somebody took the girl that he wanted away from him. You know, this guy is just trying to, like, avoid major conflict and keep everybody as alive as possible. So he's, like, the lesser of two evils, but he's not actually evil either. He's just a dude who does dude things. And I think the dude who does dude things really comes through in regards to, his relationship with Dido, which is a very interesting relationship, because it's one of those things where it's like Aeneas and Dido's romance is something I have heard about independently from the Aeneid, and it comes up like as being a great love story of the time, but it's not actually portrayed like that if you read the story, and also not portrayed like that in this book. It's sort of a, like, they had a lot of affection for each other. They had sort of a hot and steamy relationship where they were a little bit hooking up on the side, and Dido really wanted Aeneas to stay there and be her king, because she had this problem where she founded Carthage and built it up on her own as a refugee, like, bit of royalty. She built up this whole city, but because she was a woman running the city, the neighboring kingdoms all had a bunch of dudes who were like, hey, marry me. You have to marry me because I'm a guy. And so she was, like, afraid of losing her sense of control, and also her independence. And so she was looking for sort of an out, and if she got married to somebody else, she would be free from all these men trying to control her. So in a bit of manipulation with her sister helps her come up with this plan. It's a law of the city of Carthage that if people stumble on you having an illicit affair, you're married. That's just, like, the law. And so she decides to sort of trap Aeneas in this situation, because she can tell that he won't stay given the opportunity. Once he's done enjoying the comforts and the gratitude of their home, he's gonna leave. So she's like, okay, I gotta get him to stay with me. The best thing I can do is set up this elaborate situation where we end up hooking up, and my sister will catch us, and then we're married, and they'll congratulate us, like, on our wedding. And they're married for a little bit, and she's like, okay, like, I got him, I got my man, and now what do I do? And she's trying to come up with ways to, like, keep him occupied and keep him busy and happy, so that he doesn't get dissatisfied, because the potential, like, the possibility for him to leave is always there. Like, she tricked him into this marriage, and now she has to find a way to keep him there. So she thinks, like, by spoiling him and keeping him very satisfied at night, he won't go anywhere. But it turns out, like, even though he's been playing the role and acting like he's, like, ingratiating himself into the city and the structure and his new life as, like, the consort of the queen, that he's, you know, he's okay with it, but he's actually just been planning to leave the entire time. And he does. He gets on a boat, and he absolutely fucks off and just leaves her behind, abandons her, doesn't even say anything, ghosts her completely. So she's like, hey, that's horrible, and I hate you for that. But then she also feels backed into a corner, because he was her only escape from these other men who would seek to dominate and control her. So tragically, in her story, she decides to gather up all the Trojan possessions that they left behind, and then start a fire with herself on it, and then she falls onto the sword, one of the swords that were left behind, and basically unalives herself, so that she doesn't have to deal with the consequences of this sham marriage that she set up in the first place, and being abandoned by this guy who didn't want to be married to her. He just wanted to hook up. And, like, there's a lot to take away from that aspect, and seeing how, like, Aeneas was a bit cold to her, even though he was also taking advantage of her in this relationship by enjoying her comforts, the comforts of her home as a guest there, and also the comforts of her bed as she invited him there as well, without consequence. He was really enjoying taking advantage of all these things in order to restock his people who he fled the Trojan War from, like, with, he was totally okay taking advantage of her up until he realized that he was in a situation he was trapped. And then his entire, like, attitude towards her changed because he didn't appreciate her taking advantage of him in return. And so they were both toxic for each other, and this shouldn't have happened in the first place. But honestly, this was also a very interesting part of the story to me, and I kind of wish that this was the story. Because, like, outside of like his relationship with Dido, like with the relationship with Lavinia, not a lot happens. Like, there is a war going on, but it's all off the page, so you're not really involved in, like, the battles or the day-to-day stuff. You're sort of just seeing it from Lavinia's perspective, and she's stuck at the war camp, so nothing exciting is happening, except that, you know, she's sometimes having conversations or sometimes being invited to these meetings. She gets invited to, like, a meeting where she gets insulted by some men from the other side who happen to also be childhood friends of hers, but they all decided that she's the worst for not having any agency, because that's her crime. Her crime is not being in control of her own life. And then, you know, eventually her dad does decide to, like, give her a little bit of control, so he's like, you pick who you want to marry of these two shitty choices, and she ends up picking Aeneas instead. So she does get to choose the way she wanted to, and there's a bunch of prophecy that he's not going to live very long, and she's going to live and do all the things she wants to do. So it's worth it in the end to be with this guy who's kind of milquetoast to her, in order to get out of this scenario. But it's the element of choice is an illusion in her tale, and I feel like the element of choice is not an illusion in Dido's tale. And a lot of this is consequences of your actions and sort of being stuck in a position where you feel very desperate and you have to make these choices in order to preserve your autonomy. And I think it's interesting because that seems to be, like, the overall theme for the women from this story, is sort of dealing with their autonomy, the loss of it, and then the choices that they made and the fallout from that, only for us to go sideways into the tale of Creusa, who was his first wife, who, like, ended up being, she's a daughter of King Priam of Troy, one of the many children of King Priam, so she's not even a significant daughter, but because Aeneas as a boy is being sheltered with his father in their kingdom, they're living there as, like, honored guests. They end up growing up together, and so she sort of slowly develops her feelings over time. She gets to know Aeneas. He gets to know her. He starts inviting her places. It's very cute. Their childhood romance is really, really cute. And there's no, like, red flags on the field because he's still a boy for the majority of it. And it looks like this is the most genuine version of himself, before he's put into a position where he has to focus solely on his God-given mission and the consequences of everything that happens at Troy. It's prior to the war in Troy, but then, you know, it leads up to the war in Troy, and eventually, like, walking that back, it leads up to their marriage and then the war in Troy, and basically how the fallout affects her. She doesn't make it out. Creusa doesn't make it out. That's definitely a spoiler. We're in the spoiler section. But she doesn't make it out of Troy, and he ends up taking the son that he had with her, and that's when he goes on this journey, first to Carthage and then to Italy, and eventually on to found Rome. But I really like the dynamic between the two of them, and sort of getting this perspective that I think wasn't, I don't want to say it was the most positive, because she still had some of her, like, reservations. She was trying to figure out his motivations, if he was trying to be better than her brothers or worse than, but they sort of were weathering all the events of Troy together. And I think you get, like, a better perspective on Aeneas as a character from her perspective, as opposed to the characterizations that you get from his interactions with Dido. You don't really get a lot of his personality in that interaction. It's mostly just Dido's perspective and her personality that comes through. And then when you get to Lavinia's, like, she doesn't care for him, and he doesn't really super care for her. He just cares for the advantage of this, like, union that would bring him, because he needs the money, he needs the support to start his city, and he's willing to go to war for it, but not willing to make the hard decisions because it would be too easy. And that was, like, just a weird point to me, and I'll get to that in a second. But as far as Creusa, I also found her to be the most likable of the female narrators. She just seemed to be a very genuine, down-to-earth girl, who wasn't, like, she wasn't naive by any chance. Like, she was very aware of things. She just was like a sideline observer, being like the bottom rung of her father's many children. She didn't really have a stake in the game. So she was more focused on just having a happy life, being a good wife, and then being a good mother, and sort of dealing with the pitfalls of Troy. And I really liked when the Trojan War starts to get kicked off and how that plays out. The characterization of Paris and Helen I thought were very interesting, because in a lot of the stories that we've read and a lot of the retellings, they are sort of portrayed as like tragic lovers who are kind of good people really at the bottom of it, but like maybe a little bit slimy here and there, and the decisions that they've made a little bit selfish. But in this one, it's just out of the gate. Like, Paris is the worst. And then when he brings Helen over, she's also the worst, and they're made for each other in the fact that they are so horrible together. But because of these two very selfish individuals, this entire war gets kicked off, and they have to deal with like the consequences of that on the outskirts. Like, this is how Aeneas and Creusa are dealing with this, because they can see all the signs. They can see how unremorseful Paris is, and how like vapid Helen is, and how they're more than willing to commit to this cause without doing the actual work, because Paris chooses to not be on the front lines and give some bullshit reason so that he can stay back and just be an archer, while his brothers and Aeneas are having to fight on the front lines against the Greeks for this entire 10-year war. And he doesn't back down. He never gives up on his relationship with Helen. And Helen is just kind of like going through the motions, like la-di-da-di-da, as long as I get what I want, isn't it great? And I really liked that perspective from like the sister of somebody in this background sort of part of the kingdom, to be able to see how like these people's actions are coming across, how insulting they're being, how like selfish they're being, and then just having to weather this, and then knowing full well it's because these two jerks started this whole affair, and like giving up these two jerks wouldn't stop the war, because the Greeks came there under the pretense of saving Helen, but they really wanted the riches of Troy, and they weren't leaving till they got them. And there's even like a moment where Creusa's like talking to Helen, and she's like, all I would have to do is just throw her over the wall, and the Greeks could come get her body, and we could be like done with this, but that wouldn't satisfy them either. So I'm not going to. But I was like, intrusive thoughts, I 100% feel you on that, because I don't think I could have stood in front of this particular version of Helen and been like, yeah, no, you should definitely continue talking to me while you're really close to that ledge, because she was just garbage in the moment. And there's like a really sweet moment where they think that the war is over when the Greeks build the Trojan horse. And she finally gets to take her son, who, even though they have lived on the coast his entire life, her entire life as well, but his entire life, he's never actually gotten to see the ocean or like touch it, because they've been at battle his entire childhood. And so she finally gets to take her son out into the water, and he gets to experience the ocean for the first time. And it was just such a special moment, and something just so wholesome that I was like, oh my God. But also knowing the story of Troy, I was like, they don't know what's coming. The worst is coming. This is like a little bit of like sunlight before the absolute darkness of night comes. And Creusa also is the only person who believes what Cassandra says by the time they get to the end of the war. At the beginning of the war, she sort of writes off Cassandra as just her crazy sister who says crazy things, and that's why her family sent her away to the Temple of Apollo, so that she wouldn't keep bothering them with her craziness. But by the end of things, she's like, you know what, I might actually believe Cassandra, so I'm going to ask her to give me the specifics on how this is going to go down. So knowing how like her life ends here in Troy from her sister, she sets things up so that Aeneas can get away and save their son, and that's what he does. And he has to deal with the consequences of that, like Aeneas's character does, because everyone sees him as a coward for basically fleeing Troy before it completely fell, and saving the people that he saved. Like, to those Trojans, he's like their hero, he's their everything, because he saved them from the fall of their city. But to outside perspectives, they're like, he's kind of a coward for running away, but there wasn't really anything he could do. The Greeks had them overwhelmed at the point, like, when he left. So I don't know. I think maybe centering the story from Lavinia's perspective, his last wife's perspective, was maybe not the best way to like approach this story. But then like I don't know how else I would write it. maybe all of the way that it's sort of written a little bit in the Herc book that we read earlier this year, where some of the characters would continue to narrate parts of the story after they had died, and like the impact of that, and what they're seeing from the underworld. Like, so maybe like some of his lovers could continue to tell the story of Lavinia from the underworld, and like how that like impacted the whole overall narrative. But I don't know, I just could not find myself like super attached to anything in this book, or like committed to the bit or the ideas that were being like delivered in any like meaningful capacity. I had a really hard time getting fully immersed in this. And I think part of the way too is just because the story bounced around to all these different narrators back and forth, it was also bouncing around through time. And I was like, I understand, like I didn't lose track of the time, but I just like found that to be the most disjointed way to tell me the story, and maybe would have preferred it if they had just done Creusa's section, Dido's section, and then Lavinia's section. That might have like told me a more linear story that made it a lot easier to sort of process the information I was being given, and then understand the character of Aeneas a little bit better, because that's the whole purpose of this story, was to tell the tale of Aeneas without telling it from his perspective. And I don't know if I love this approach to these sort of things. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I would have loved to see something more complex be done here, or something different be done with the story, especially from Lavinia's perspective. Because she's just kind of existing while things happen to her. Whereas I felt like Creusa had a little bit more agency because she was making her own choices, and Dido had more agency because she was also making her own choices. But Lavinia spends the entire time just sort of responding to the things that happen to her, as opposed to being very decisive about things. And even when she's decisive about things, it's not like in regards to herself. It's in regards to trying to force Aeneas to get into this duel to end the war. That's when she's like, I have to make him do this. I'm going to pick him. I'm going to make him do this duel. And then I'm going to pester the shit out of this man until he does it. And that's essentially how she gets things across. But she doesn't, like, she's not reacting to things outside of stuff that happens to her. She doesn't take a lot of agency or a lot of action. She just sort of observes things and then goes, oh, well, this is how I feel. And that makes it very hard to get immersed into a character, especially because I think the point was that she didn't have a lot of control, but she will eventually, once this whole thing boils over. But it's just not the most fascinating perspective to be reading from. And like I said, the story was written well enough. I understood everything that happened. It was easy enough to read. I didn't struggle through like any parts or anything like that. It just wasn't for me, I think. So I'm very, very middle of the road on it. I don't think I would read it again, but I didn't hate it. There were good things that I could pull from it, and there were some negative things I could pull from it, but otherwise I wasn't really like super moved on the needle one way or the other. And I think it's just the lack of immersion with the way that the story was told. But that's going to be it for me, guys. It's everything I have to say about this book for the time being. I will be continuing this discussion in the chat. So those of you who have read the book or want to join the chat because you have read the book, definitely send me a message so I can add you to it. But the rest of my book club people will be having this chat, and we'll continue it over there on Instagram and get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty and the details, because that's where this stuff comes up. And then again, if you are going to read with us next month, we're reading Medea by Eilish, Quin. And yeah, that's gonna be it for me, guys. If you made it to the end of the video, I appreciate your faces, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Until then, guys, happy crafting. Bye.